Dr. Will Cole. It's so nice to see you again, my friend, and so nice to have you back in the studio talking about what you talk about so incredibly well. Thank you for joining me again. It's really, I'm so excited to chat to you again.
Thank you, my friend. We just started saying this before we started recording, that it takes a podcast for two busy people to catch up sometimes.
It's crazy.
So, hi, friend.
Hi, friend. And we've been trying to do something together for so long, so at least we can get this podcast, but we're going to do something soon for your new book. So, Will, I'm very excited. You really help people all around the world to manage their health through nutrition. And you have a very unique approach, and you are really an expert when it comes to inflammation. Your previous book was about that. Now, this book is about gut health and the gut-brain connection, which we know has been around for years. It was introduced back in almost a whole century ago, but I think it's only in the last, what would you say, 10 years or so, or even 5 years, that people have really started understanding this connection. And I get so many questions about it. So I'm so thrilled to have you as an expert talking about this. So I'm really excited to talk about your new book, Gut Feelings. And I really like the feelings part because, as you know, I do all the mind, body, brain stuff. So, and the feelings are a huge part of it. So tell us about the book. Tell us what this book's about, big picture, and then I want to dive into some quite specific stuff in the book.
Sure. I mean, this book is such right up your alley. I mean, it's a central part of my work, and it really, it is your work. It's really looking at the interconnectedness, the confluence of factors that come into play when you're talking about mental health. And it's a conversation that I have on an hourly basis with my telehealth patients about the fact that mental health is not separate from physical health. Mental health is physical health, and really talking about what are the components of mental health. But I thought, it's a time to have this conversation for people beyond just my patients. So Gut Feelings is really that, I think, furthering that discussion around mental health, which I think you and I both can agree. It's great that the conversation and maybe the destigmatizing around mental health is a good thing. We're normalizing people getting access and talking about mental health care. But in many ways, coming from a functional medicine perspective, I think in many ways it's an incomplete conversation that the conventional mainstream world's having around mental health, because it just we relegate mental health to this sort of separate avenue. But the reality is you can't have a full conversation about mental health until you realize that it's just as physical as any other health issue, right? And talking about the inflammatory components to mental health issues, and in many ways, the bidirectional relationship, I think, between mental health and physical health. How in the book, I explore these things that I measure on patients' labs, like underlying gut problems, leaky gut syndrome, or people that have small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. We see a lot of people that have reactive food sensitivities, histamine intolerance, mast cell activation syndrome, and chronic infections like mold toxins, chronic Lyme disease, physiological things, how I'm umbrellaing it in the book under the gut side. So we have gut and feelings. And the gut side is all that stuff that we can measure on labs that impact our mood, impact things like anxiety and depression and brain fog and fatigue. And then conversely, the feeling side of gut feelings, things like stress, chronic stress, shame, trauma, even intergenerational trauma, how these mental, emotional, spiritual things in some ways, how those things impact our physical body, how they could be literally stored in our cells, how they can dysregulate our nervous system, raising inflammation levels, impacting our hormones, impacting our gut-brain axis. So I wanted to have a both and, not an either or conversation around both gut and feelings, and how our mood and our health are impacted by both. And it's by dealing with both, it's how I see our patients just really recover and overcome these seemingly insurmountable things like mental health issues or autoimmune problems.
I'm so grateful, Will, that you've written this book, because you have a very nice way of writing. You make things very simple, and people are hearing a lot of this messaging today, but to have it in one place where it's easy to understand is so important. And that psychoneurobiological link is vital. It's really, we're seeing this all the time, every day in our research. We're seeing that constant, significant relationship between what you do with your mind is impacting how you're managing stress, etc., is impacting the biology of every cell. As you so rightly said, every cell of our body is embodying our mind experience. So there's an impact on our brain and our body, and then that impact feeds back into, that bidirectional relationship. So we can't separate these. And what's so super interesting, Will, is that and you point this out all the time in your work and your podcast and in this book, that people know we must talk about mental health, and people know we must talk about gut health, but people, and they know there's a relationship, but it's still the people that the majority of professionals, that people that are battling with issues go to, aren't trained in that. And you comment in your book, I think they have 19 hours at med school of training, and like mental health, they have even less. I mean, all the rotations that they have are just going to label and diagnose. And, so this relationship is between the psychoneurobiology is not sufficiently handled. And I'm very grateful that you've brought this book out to make it so simple. So I'd love to begin with helping people have a simple understanding, but I have a great audience that loves science. So if you can give us like a little lesson on the gut-brain connection and the bidirectional relationship, would be a fantastic place to start. Then we're going to dive into some other things.
Yeah,
is that
absolutely.
a good place to start? Are you comfortable starting there, or is there a better place to start?
I love that. I think it's a good setting the stage for the rest of the conversation. Yeah. The gut and brain are formed from the same fetal tissue. So when babies were growing in their mother's womb, the gut and brain are formed from that same tissue, and they are inextricably woven together for the rest of our life through what's known as the gut-brain axis, or the connection between the gut and the brain. And if people think about it, the intestines even kind of resemble the brain. It's not on accident. And 95% of serotonin is made in the gut and stored in the gut, our happy neurotransmitter, of which SSRIs and medications, antidepressants work upon. Many of them do. And 50% of dopamine is made in the gut, stored in the gut, which we need for pleasure as well. So there's a reason why researchers call the gut the second brain. And to understand brain health, to understand mental health, we have to look at the other side of the gut-brain axis. And there's no surprise then that there's a lot of studies coming out of the scientific literature. Like you said, the past decade plus or so, it's been trickling in the journals, but now even more so in mainstream pop culture, even conversations that people are having with their doctor. And in another 10 years, it's going to be even more of a common conversation that people have. We're only just scratching the surface of this as far as it permeating popular culture and people getting access to this information. But there's a reason why that the studies are looking at different bacterial colonies and different imbalances in the microbiome, lower levels of some beneficial bacteria, higher levels of some opportunistic and pathogenic bacteria that we can quantify on labs today, are very much associated in the scientific literature to things like anxiety and depression and neurological autoimmune problems. So these are things that people don't realize. They think, oh, I'm just anxious, I'm just depressed, but they have to realize that it's multifactorial, and the gut is a piece of the puzzle. And for some people, it's a significant piece of the puzzle as to why they feel the way that they do. So it's from a neurotransmitter standpoint, it's certainly important, but then ultimately our gut is also home to about 75% of our immune system. Inflammation is a product of the immune system. So there's a whole field of literature that, for people that are newer to this, it's called the cytokine model of cognitive function. Cytokines are pro-inflammatory cells. So it's research really exploring, how does inflammation impact mental health? How does inflammation impact how our brain works? And if we're going to look at the model, the sort of traditional model of mental health care and understanding it, they talk about chemical imbalances, quote unquote, or neurotransmitter imbalances. If that is true, we have to ask, well, what's causing the neurotransmitter balances in the first place? What's causing the signaling problems? Well, in my opinion, a major part of that is both the gut and the feeling side. The underlying gut problems, the inflammation issues, chronic infections, environmental toxins are going to impact how neurotransmitters are expressed and the communication lines, the crosstalk, if you will, between our gut microbiome, this gut garden that regulates neurotransmitter health and brain health, and also the inflammatory component. And then the third part here on the physiological side is the vagus nerve, which is the major part of what's connecting the gut and the brain, a major aspect of the autonomic nervous system, the parasympathetic side of it, the resting, the digesting, the hormone balance, the neurotransmitter balance aspect of our nervous system. But then the feeling side just as well, right? I mean, the mental, emotional, spiritual component has to be looked at as well, because that stuff is, as I call it in the book, it's junk food for it just as much. Like stress is the ultimate junk food. Like it's junk food for the soul, but it's more than the soul. It's junk food for the body just as much as your breakfast, lunch, and dinner that's not loving you back as well. So we have to realize that these physical and, in some ways, let's call it metaphysical things have to be looked at, understand, well, why am I having anxiety? Why am I having depression? Why am I having brain fog or fatigue? It has to be a both and conversation. And part of that both and conversation is looking at how the gut influences our mood.
That's so important what you've just highlighted. The fact that it's our environment and our experiences in our environment. So we can have an experience in our environment that is toxic, and that's going to impact our gut because our experience goes through every cell and our cells make up all the different parts, including the gut. And if people understand that, it's really a massive part. And then also sometimes we ingest toxins and we ingest bacteria and it goes into whatever viruses and so on. And that's impacting. So there's this constant bidirectional. So I agree with you, Will. It's crazy that it's something that's so vital, but it's not really, it will change. It will change. People are getting more and more aware. I want to just comment on the impact of environment and life on our gut. I wanted to make a comment about the chemical imbalance. They've also tried to simplify that whole concept of saying that mental health is related to a chemical imbalance. So someone has people have huge stories. Everyone is not one single person who's not, mental health is everyone's issue. There's no one it's obviously different on a spectrum, but the fact that they just try and simplify it down to a chemical imbalance, that was a myth. It's been disproved over and over. There was a paper that came out in July last year, Jana Moncrief, saying that this chemical imbalance is a myth and once again proving it. So we've got to, the tendency to just simplify it as it being just one thing. I'm depressed because of one thing.
Mm-hmm.
What you're saying in your book, from what I've read, and I know how your work is, we've got to look at the whole person. And we've got to look at that gut-brain connection as being a massive part of that whole person because it's the quickest, the vagus nerve, everything you've just described. Your gut really feels the impact very quickly. Every cell in your body does, but the gut really feels it fast. And it's like, an almost immediate reaction.
Yeah, and it's true. And that's why things like SIBO, for example, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, are associated with things like anxiety and depression. So, SIBO is what drives IBS. So anybody that's dealing with irritable bowel syndrome, uncomfortable bloating, many people would describe it as feeling 9 months pregnant, but not being 9 months pregnant. That's SIBO, which is a bacterial imbalance that not only causes very uncomfortable digestive issues that we need to heal from, but it's very much connected to anxiety and depression. And then you have to sort of suss out and untangle what came first, the chicken or the egg. And it depends on the case, right? Certainly trauma, mental, emotional trauma, past trauma, even physical trauma like whiplash or a sport injury, that can impact the nervous system, which can drive digestive issues. But then conversely, underlying gut problems, we know because of the bacterial colony imbalances, very much can impact neurotransmitter expression. And even if you look under the certain studies that are looking at autoimmunity, they have proven that it's a causative factor. The bacterial imbalances are a causative factor to triggering these autoimmunities. So it's both a cause and effect, but like you said, it's this vicious cycle of one begets the other.
And you have to look at both sides of the coin. So that's where, we added in a day and an age where we need to be informed as people going to our doctors, as clients going to, as humans going to our doctors. It's a different type of medicine now. It's a different, when you have something wrong, we have these books like yours to help people understand, hey, maybe it's this, and could I look at this? Because not every doctor is going to be able to give you the solution without, sometimes we have to help them along. So your book is great for that, for people to help understand a little bit more on that side. I'd love to talk a little bit about something. I'm going to read a little paragraph from your book because it's something that most people possibly didn't think about much in terms of gut and brain, and also related to the fact that your gut, a large part of your immune system, we know it's in the brain and we know it's in the gut. And that's also quite new research. We didn't think that the brain had its own immune system, but it does. And it's all linked to the gut and that whole. So I'd love to talk a little bit more about that. But I'm going to read where you have coined a term, shameflammation. And I'm just going to read the first paragraph in that little section. In my book, The Inflammation Spectrum, this is Will's book, not mine, I describe chronic inflammation as a smoldering fire within, a fire that goes largely unnoticed until it turns into any number of health problems. Well, throughout my years of treating patients and helping them get their bodies and minds back to vibrant health, I've seen the ways that negative thoughts and emotions can subtly and systematically sabotage health in much the same ways inflammation can. In fact, I see this phenomenon of emotional suffering causing physical suffering so often that I decided to give it its own name, shameflation. Okay, so talk about that. I love it. I love your book, but that's really a favorite part of my book because shame is so massive. And the link that you've built between shame and inflammation and gut health, and then the whole bidirectional feedback thing we've been discussing is very, very interesting.
Thank you. It's interesting. I have never said this on a podcast, but of course I'd tell my friend, you first. Originally, the title of the book for Gut Feelings was going to be Shameflammation, but then me and the publishers decided to make it more positive of gut feelings, and like it's not just about shame, and we want to heal people from these issues too.
Yeah,
but
good point.
The concept of shameflammation is a massive part of the book because it is this connection between mental health and physical health and how there's both and conversation. But shame, the research around shame, I mean, even though it's vastly under-researched in both of our opinions, but and the work that you're doing is really hoping is progressing that and changing that over time. But it is I think an umbrella emotion that a lot of my patients feel to varying degrees, but this sense of shame and stress and dread and chronic stress overall in their life, and how these things, and I would add to that unresolved past trauma that they're living out today. And all of these things are contributing to the immune system being stuck in this chronic inflammatory state, in part or connected to the nervous system being stuck in that sympathetic fight or flight, stressed, inflamed state. And it is a massive piece of the puzzle. And I see people that have done all the gut stuff, right? The gut dealt with the feelings, the gut side of the gut feelings equation of getting their gut healthy, eating healthier foods, working out, doing meditation, but they haven't really gone deeper into the feeling side of it, of really looking at their chronic stress, really dealing with past trauma, and this. And part of that conversation that I'm having in the book around shameflammation is specifically about people's relationship with food and people's relationship with their body. And it was my opportunity, I think, in the book to have a conversation about the wellness industry and how I feel like in many ways we've fallen short for the average layperson out there, because there's so much conflicting information. I mean, Dr. Google is like this endlessly fickle physician, which we can substantiate our worst fears, our own agenda and confirmation bias at the click of a button. And we create these sort of toxic tribalism online that only adds to the shame and the disillusionment and overwhelm that people have. So that's part of the shameflammation conversation. It's not just the past stuff per se or people's general life, but it's what is my relationship with food? What's my relationship with my body? And what's my relationship with this thing that we call wellness? Because for so many people, it can start off with good intentions, but can become a source of orthorexia, which is a disordered eating around healthy things in our life. And stressing about healthy food isn't good for your health. Shaming yourself about not working out enough isn't good for your health. And that contributing factors to this dysregulated nervous system, sympathetic fight or flight stress state. So it's an important conversation that I have to have with my patients all the time, that I really feel like the world is like yearning to realize this stuff. And hopefully my book can at least play a part in making the connection that it's really an underlying hidden saboteur to why people are stuck at these plateaus and are able to continue to heal.
So important. Can you give an example? I don't know if you can create a fictitious example or sort of pull from different clients or patients, or if you can example from your own life, but that principle of shame and the relationship with food and the wellness industry, I think you've hit something really, could you talk more detail, give a more specific example about that? Because it's so good. I'm so glad you brought up about the wellness industry, because really, what do people do? There's just so much advice. How do you wade your way through? And I've done the 10 steps and I'm still this, or I've done
You and I are always trying to bring context, and grace and lightness to these conversations, because context, grace, and lightness are important. And that's what I talk about in the book. Like, Grace, how do you imbue what grace and lightness back into wellness? Like, how should there be an ease and like remembering the why of why we're even doing these things of cleaning up our mental mess or eating clean foods or working out or whatever we're doing? Like, what's the context? You and I know the context, but we realize that we always have to check ourselves and how we're even communicating to people, because I feel like there's so much information out there that sometimes where the person's at in their health journey, like their vessel's only so big, for lack of a better term. And like we have so much light or so much information to give them that it's like overwhelming them. And sometimes it's good to just lean in and meet yourself where you're at on your journey, and some action's better than no action. And I'd rather someone be consistent with the less and versus doing all the things and feeling like they're a failure if they can't continue to do all the things, because you don't necessarily have to do all the things, because again, it's the mindset and the why of why you're even doing these things. So a common scenario that I see is, because I'm coming from a clinical side, functional medicine side, my patients are people that are dealing with a lot of autoimmune problems, a lot of food reactions, hormonal imbalances, things like anxiety and depression, brain fog and fatigue. So I realize that I'm not the average. I don't have like the average person out there, but I think this is an important part, because I think a lot of the people that listen to your podcast probably have gone through similar things. They've gone through trauma and stress, or dealing with gut problems, or dealing with brain problems. And I feel like those are all real, physiologically real stuff. Nobody's going to deny that in our space. We know this. Those people tend to have more digestive problems, and they tend to have more food reactions because of that. So this is what I've experienced clinically is that this is a different avenue of orthorexia than maybe the general like average fitness person out there, right? That maybe could get disordered orthorexia in a different way. These people do have food sensitivities. They have reactions to foods that don't love them back right now. And then there's so much trauma from their flare up, or trauma from their brain fog or fatigue or digestive issue or some sort of inflammatory symptom, that they end up, because of that physical trauma around food, they end up fearing the foods, and they don't ever want to have that flare up again. They don't know what to trust. They don't know what foods are going to work for them and not. And then over time, as things maybe can get more out of hand because of that bidirectional stress response around eating, they end up have 5 foods to eat, and then they read things online and they listen to things and they think, okay, I should take that food out and that food out. And then they hear about all the supplements they need to take, and they have this supplement graveyard of trying to figure this out. And they're left with a supplement graveyard and 5 foods to eat, and a lot of stress and anxiety and shame around their body and food and wellness. So this is a scenario that I think is a massive problem within
for sure,
our world, our community, and the people that listen to us. It's a complex conversation, because then you have the conflicting opinions, I think, out there in the mainstream world, that you'll have the diet culture and then the anti-diet culture that I talk about in the book. And the anti-diet culture says there's no such thing as a bad food and eat whatever you want. But those people know that's not true for me. If I ate that food, I would feel horrible. So they know intuitively that side's not really making sense. And then the diet culture is saying stress and shame, and they know that's wrong too. But they know that food isn't their friend right now. At least a lot of food's not their friend. So that untangling around that, I have a real reaction to food. I don't want to feel like that, but I have to eat. Where do we go from here? So it's really looking at both the gut and the feeling side of that to say, how do we heal the gut so we can bring things in? And part of healing the gut, you have to do with the gut stuff and the feeling stuff. Because I see people that we work on all the physical stuff of healing the gut, like dealing with mold toxicity, dealing with SIBO, but they don't deal with the feeling side.
Exactly.
And they get stuck at a wall, right? We get them like 50-70% better, but they're stuck at this plateau. The feeling side has to be brought in to move past that plateau. So it's dealing with their limbic system, dealing with that sort of past trauma that they're dealing with, or the trauma around food. They're retraining their brain, which is what your work is all about, to kind of move past that plateau. So that's a major, I guess, manifestation of shameflammation that I see all too often, sadly, with my patients.
Thank you for that. That's an excellent answer. You know, the neurocycle that I've developed is all about getting people to drive their mind in the right direction so they can rewire the brain. And that's what you're basically saying, is that it's very interesting. There's so much that you said there that were pearls of wisdom, but I want to just sort of emphasize one point where you said that you can get them 50 to 70% healed through doing all the external physical things, which are really important because there's an impact of life. You have to deal with that. There's damage there, identify it, you fix it. And there's certain things you can do that you can help with the SIBO and the IBS and so on. But then they kind of get stuck or go back because the source that's feeding the cells is your mind. And how you're managing your mind is going to be driving. So you can do all the physical, but if you don't balance that, I totally agree. And that's really where our work crosses over beautifully, is that you have to process, you have to manage your mind without a doubt, or you're going to get stuck. So that's really was brilliant. You also talk about something that's really quite a subject that's quite, you talk about so much stuff, but I wanted to just hone in on something that is very in at the moment as well. And that's the concept of toxic productivity. You know, we've gone from hustle culture and toxic positivity and all these things. People are now saying, hey, being over positive. People are saying, hey, it's not normal to be toxically positive it's toxic to be positive all the time. Same thing with the hustle culture. This is not the ideal. It isn't a badge of honor to say, oh, I'm working so hard. You know, we all automatically say, hey, we're busy, but in that busyness, is there time for rest? And you're really good. Like, you will not work after a certain time. You don't take calls after a certain time when you're with your family. And, you know, that's something that you've really built into your lifestyle. And you know, that's something that I've had to learn to build into my lifestyle too, like so many people. So can you talk about toxic productivity hurting your health and how people that get stuck in this, hey, I'm working 15 hours a day. Well, you may be producing something and enjoying your work or not enjoying your work, but your gut is battling when you go beyond the time period of that you should be working and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, you know, this is part of that, I think, conversation around healthy boundaries, which I think is a good thing, but we need to maybe have a further conversation around that. Like, I think healthy boundaries with ourselves is really important.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, I talk about healthy boundaries around food and diet culture and all that stuff, and reframing, I think, that paradigm. But specifically with toxic productivity, a lot of our patients, again, this book is just born out of what I've seen clinically with my patients. A lot of our patients are the sort of type A, always on the go. And they're sort of used of that. They're used to that grind of always on the go. And even if they're not working outside the home, we know being a stay-at-home parent is one of the most grueling jobs too.
Oh,
and there's
gosh.
no
Chronic
off button
stress,
on that. Right? And that's, you know, my wife, I see it so much. And, you know, it's important to have that support system and resources, people to get access to resources to get that off time as much as they can and get that self-care. And in many ways, it's easier for people that aren't a stay-at-home mom because they actually have the option to leave work and to implement these healthy boundaries around work. Because if our nervous system, and in turn, our immune system with chronic inflammation, is perpetually in that sympathetic, even if it's a low grade, even if you're used to it, right? But you're just always, the way that my patients describe it is feeling that wired and tired. It's that background anxiety. It's that background heart palpitation that you're just so used to it. Just because something's common doesn't necessarily mean it's normal when it comes to these type of things. Just because something's your everyday doesn't mean you should settle for it. And this is certainly an example of that, as that's the feeling side, right? How are we going to practice acts of stillness, is how I call it in the book. Like, how are we going to bring healthy margins in your life to be supportive of the parasympathetic? So a lot of the prescriptions, if you will, that I give in the book, I basically compiled my favorite gut and feeling action items over the protocol of the book. So people could really take both the gut and a feelings action item to support their parasympathetic nervous system, which you and I both know, that's the aspect of the autonomic nervous system that isn't doing so well. And we need to really downregulate that sympathetic tone and increase the parasympathetic and the vagal tone to feel better, to not feel anxious and exhausted all the time. And healthy boundaries with work is a major part of that, or healthy boundaries with life itself.
That's great. Yeah. So let's swing over into some practical tips that people can directly let's springboard from this particular question. You know, that what does that look like? And I know you're going to say things that people have heard before, but I like the way you say it. So can you give some nice practical, let's talk about practical tips now. And I know you handle a lot of it in your book.
A massive part of this, I mean, look, I think this is good. I'm going to offend so many people right now, but it's going to be, and it's said in love, but it's their relationship with their phone, right? Their phone is typically a vehicle for the work stuff. And then people will say, I'm so busy with work. I just want to come home and just do something mind numbing and scroll social media. But then you have that FOMO inducing content on social media that's perpetuating that sympathetic tone, the fight or flight tone. So I think both from a work and a sort of sympathetic activation of social media, both need to be looked at. And the commonality of that for many people is their cell phone. So for me, I don't really have an option because I'm seeing patients all day online. I can't have even the buzzing of my phone, even if it's on silent. People are like, yeah, I have my phone on silent, but you hear the dun, 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 dun of the phone vibrating. It's still pulling you out of the present moment and making you think, well, what message is that? I have to check it. Or people have the Apple Watch, and it's constantly being dinging.
Yeah,
you need to streamline, simplify your life. I talk about the Scandinavian practice, this ancient practice. There's a lot of cool research around it too, about Hygge, right? To sort of making your life comfy and simple and sort of like nourishing. And one of the action items in the book is really practicing these practices of Hygge and simplifying, making your life this sanctuary in many ways. And doing a digital detox, doing a tech detox is a great idea to do that. And what that can look like is turning off, like making your phone completely no notifications, silencing all notifications, silencing all text messages. You do not get the pop-ups. And putting your phone on airplane mode, maybe when you get home with your family, or putting your phone in a basket, or turning it off at the end of the night. I mean, whatever you have to do to create these healthy boundaries. And then people, a lot of the iPhones will have the downtime ability to make your own downtime, but I see people just overriding their own parameters. So sometimes you have to go above and beyond that to really separate yourself from your phone. And one way is when you wake up in the morning to really just take a beat and not have your phone for as long as you can have. Maybe wait until lunchtime to check your phone if it's possible for you. Is just start off your morning with, how are you going to make the seed of your day? How are you going to really plant the seed of your day? So many people wake up and one of the first things they do is check their phone. What has happened through the night? Something has happened through the night that's so pressing that you need to check first thing in the morning. But really simplifying your morning, maybe it's going and looking at the sun first thing in the morning, which is a great way to reset your circadian rhythm. Maybe it's doing some grounding practices, or I talk about in the book the research around grounding and Shinrin-yoku, which is forest bathing in Japan, of the research of using nature as a meditation and a medicine, and simple, low cost and free things that we can do, like grounding and forest bathing, getting some natural sunlight in the morning, like low horizon light. Those are some practical things people do instead of looking at their phone. Maybe it's you and I both like our peak tea, right? I love peak tea. So I just make a green peak tea and use tea as a meditation practice, which has been used in Japanese culture for a long time, of actually making it a ritual. And these sort of simple rituals of stillness can be very therapeutic at supporting a parasympathetic. And none of that has to do with your phone. And honestly, none of it is really that sort of high end, exclusive. It's accessible to most people.
No, that's fantastic. Let's blend this with some tips for the eating side of things. You mentioned that a lot of people have allergies and then they get these reactions and they're terrified to eat those foods again. And obviously you can't, you're not giving blanket advice now, because if it's not a cookie cutter advice situation, everyone's totally unique. But that fear that builds up around eating, where does someone start if they are in this situation where they just don't know what to do with their diet and everything seems to be affecting them, and it's to pass out what's causing what, it can also be overwhelming. So we all know that our mind drives our brain and our body, and we know that the gut health issue is a direct link to every cell of our body, but you feel it quickest in the gut brain reaction. So what would be first steps? You have a 21-day program in here. But what would be first steps if someone is sitting here listening to this now and they're just saying, oh gosh, I can relate to everything. Where do I start? Do I start with my mental health? Do I start with my physical health? You're telling me to do both at the same time. What does that look like?
Yeah. So obviously, I put together the protocol in the book. It's 21 days. As I say in the book, I am not saying that you're going to heal all your past trauma, intergenerational trauma, and shame in 21 days.
Definitely not. At least 63, as we know. It takes at least one cycle, multiple cycles of 63.
That's right. But I want them to see what's the most evidence-based, effective, easiest, accessible ways for them to support their gut and their feelings. And these are 21 of each. So we have 42 of the best actions for gut and feelings that I've seen work well for patients. So I don't think it should be an either or. Now, look, I think that meeting a person where they're at, and this sort of the science and art of what I do with patients, and knowing, okay, what are they able to even receive or handle right now? Back to like the doing something versus nothing point that I made earlier. There are some people that everybody's configuration of puzzle pieces of how they're going to heal look different. And remember, I said like 50 to 70% of dealing with the physical stuff. For some people, which I know that there's like, it's mostly not physical at all. It's all the mental, emotional, spiritual stuff. And they really deal with that. And then the physical stuff's like 20% of their puzzle. Exactly. So everybody's configuration of gut and feelings as far as what's the most needle moving for them is going to be different. But that's why I think a both and approach is good, but even just these micro moments and just being consistent with the micro moments can be very influential on your health over time and with consistency. But I know some people, they get their physical, they start healing their gut physically with some of the action items that we do. And that gets their head above that proverbial water enough to have the bandwidth, because when they don't feel inflamed, their nervous system's calmed down, their hormones are more balanced, there's less neuroinflammation. They have the resilience and the bandwidth to be able to do the mental, emotional, spiritual feeling side a lot more effortlessly. But then I see some people, their relationship with food is so battered that they have to at least start to do the mental, emotional, spiritual stuff first to even be able to handle a breakfast, lunch, and dinner that loves them back. So it's definitely going to be different for different people. But every day, I think we can make at least one action item, one simple, accessible action to support the gut and the feelings. And for the gut side specifically, since you asked, I mean, I think it's day one in the protocol, maybe day two. It's day two in the protocol. I say, if you do nothing else, be consistent with this to support your gut health. It's adapted from what's called a GAPS protocol, which is an acronym that stands for gut and psychology syndrome, or gut and physiology syndrome, which is the acronym GAPS, which is a protocol that we implement in many of our patients' protocol, at least at some point in their journey, to really be supportive of the gut brain axis. And it's a lot of soups and stews, and we give lots of recipes and pretty pictures in the book so people can learn how to cook these things very simply to be almost like a proverbial siesta for their gut health. And we are what we eat. You've heard that, like the foods we eat are the raw material to make up our cells and make up our neurotransmitters and make up our hormones. But we are ultimately what we absorb, meaning if your gut's unhealthy, you're not absorbing foods. And eating foods can be very stressful for some people's body. Their gut's bloated, even, the amount of people that I see get bloated from salads and vegetables. And then they think, man, I can't even have vegetables, which are kind of the epitomization in our culture of a healthy food. Where the heck am I supposed to go with this? But by having soups and stews, it's one way to break down the plant fibers to make those foods more digestible and in turn more bioavailable, i.e. usable from a nutrient density standpoint for your body. So every day I'm encouraging the reader in the book to really almost do a gut reset in a way to be supportive of their gut health by these soups and stews. And there's vegan soups, there's bone broth soups and stews to really be helpful. And I even talk about a phenomenon that I see clinically of people that have histamine intolerance and mast cell activation syndrome, which can cause a lot of anxiety and brain fog for sure. And I teach how to do the soups in a low histamine way, because everyone talks about the benefits of bone broth, which it is wonderful, but even healthy foods, what works for one person may not work for the next person.
Exactly.
And again, I'm in the world of food sensitivities. So I want to adapt it and evolve it, customize it, if you will, for the individual. So even bone broth can be higher histamine. So some of these people they're trying to do the right things, and then they go and have this food, and it's like, oh man, everything that they're telling me to do, I'm having a negative response to. Well, we're going to figure it out for you. We're going to walk you through this. I'm used to these complex, off the wall things that aren't so off the wall for me, but maybe for the person that's going through it.
I've got page 144 open in front of me, and you talk about the gut. You give a little gut thing, like for example, up your protein intake, and then you give a feeding, balance the anxiety equation. So you're giving like little things that you can do collectively together to help a person. You talk about the stress of good food, even good food making you unhealthy. The keto craze, when it was sort of, and we were all doing keto at one point, and it's not that I'm knocking keto, and you talk a lot about doing it in a balanced way, but it's mainly nuts. Everything's nut flours, nut. And I knew I battled with nuts myself, and years then I felt like I'd grown out of it. So going into full-on keto, where everything was, I had such inflammation in my joints and everything. And as soon as I stopped all nuts again completely and went, because even that, when you say that even healthy foods, now I only eat clean food and lots of soups, and even those were starting to affect me. But as soon as I removed that really great food, I mean, nuts are phenomenal, but in my body it didn't work, and it was definitely cool. So just talking about I wanted to use that as an example of even healthy foods. If you have some kind of a response, it can even affect the other, like the salad makes you bloat kind of concept.
Yeah.
So it is a matter of encouraging people to not just give up, but to really explore. And there is a solution. There is a way through it. And the process of exploring can be a bit anxiety provoking, but it's also exciting. So it's how you look at that's where the mental side comes in. And then you talk about, making soups and stews. It takes more time, but that in itself is a meditation practice. It can be, it's a relaxation practice. So the blending of both worlds, which you've achieved in this book, is really great. It's beautiful.
Right.
So
thank you.
Thank you for writing it. So
you're
go
welcome.
ahead.
Yeah. And even with the soups, like you said, like you can batch make these things and have them for the week, right?
That's what I do,
maybe at the beginning of the week, it's a little bit more, but you can really have your whole week planned. And that's some of the, meal planning is definitely something I want people to know about. Just be proactive for your week. And once you get a few weeks under your belt, what seemed overwhelming at the beginning is not, because it's really just part of your routine and ritual. And I'll be honest with you that when you feel great, you have more resilience.
Absolutely.
And the things that overwhelmed you before aren't always going to be overwhelming. You just have to do enough to get your head above that proverbial water. So then you can realize, oh, wow, I want to do the things that continue to make me feel good. Like the paradigm that I talk in the book is like avoiding foods that don't love you back isn't restrictive. It's self-respect. And then conversely,
that's so nice.
Continuing to eat foods that don't love you back is like staying in a toxic relationship, wondering why you're still miserable. And I think so many people have this like supercharged negative relationship around food, and it's diet culture, quote unquote, toxic diet culture.
And the wellness industry. Yeah.
Right. But ultimately, we need to realize that we're loving our body enough to nourish it with things that love us back. And that's the paradigm shift of what I talk in the book. I call it food peace. It's like having peace around the foods you eat, having peace about the body that you've been given, and how can we take care of it? It is all a message of really positivity and agency over your health. It's just going to take time for you to be consistent to get there. But believe me, I see people up against very, very heavy stuff, overcome it. And I really want people, we're talking about heavy things, but ultimately healing is so possible. Healing is nonlinear, but extremely possible.
Nonlinear, possible, and takes a lot of time. Yeah. And that's, you don't just work overnight and find a solution for your patients. They're with you over a period of time. And it's a matter of searching and not giving up. And in our quick fix society, and grab that book, you must do these 5 things, you must take these supplements. It's, as we spoke in the beginning, that can be very overwhelming. So sort of like as a almost final kind of conclusion, you started off with talking, in your book, you mentioned about the wellness industry and how it can be overwhelming. What would your advice be to someone who has got every wellness book, not that you can have, but on their bookshelf, and they've read it all and they've got all this? What should they do? Put the books aside for a while, get your book and start that, and it's another wellness book, but what should they do? Because they're hearing this from so many people. What would be a good place for them to start?
Well, I do feel like an editing of their life is important.
I love that. An
We
editing
have
of your
our
life.
patients go off of, really put parameters around the things they're searching online and what are the things that are nourishing them, and really think like, what is making me feel light and what's making me feel really anxious and shame-based and adding to my sort of obsessive thoughts around these things. So I would say, look at the people you're following on social media. Like, who are the people that are really, I don't want to use the word triggering, but who are the people that are really activating your sympathetic fight or flight, stressed, anxious, shame-based way? Unfollow them. Like, it's not personal. It's for your own self-care right now. At this point in your journey, it's just too much. So I would say, and even edit the things you're listening to. I think podcasts like this are wonderful. They're encouraging, but some people go to listen to other podcasts and they think more is better as far as content. And they're sort of mass consuming content that it's just not edifying them right now. It's not like lifting them up. It's just perpetuating their sort of paralysis of analysis and not actually creating some stillness and some space in their life. So I would say curate the podcast, curate the people you're following on social media, curate the people you talk to in your personal life of things that are still going to challenge you. It's okay to be challenged, but we all know intuitively as humans, like, what is part of our journey? Where am I at right now? And what's going to actually lift me up instead of just add to my confusion and stress and shame? So that's what I would say as a first step for people in this situation.
Oh, I love that. We've had a beautiful conversation around gut feelings, gut health, and all of these incredibly important impact that through the bidirectional relationship, complex stuff. But your final word of wisdom is profound, because it is really curate your life, edit your life. You don't have to do all those things. It's simplified, streamlined, and you can only do that by standing back and starting to do an edit process. I love that. On that note, Will, I don't want people to lose that edit your life concept. I think it's brilliant, and congratulations on your book. I recommend this book. Where can people get hold of you?
Yeah. Thank you, my friend. I appreciate it. Gut Feelings is everywhere that books are sold. You can get it on Amazon, Target, Barnes & Noble. You can get it on indie books. Support your independent bookstores if you have one in your area. Yeah, so all the pre-order stuff's at drwillcole.com. We have a quiz, actually, that I adapted from questions that I ask patients, and we adapted it from an adverse childhood experience score, like an ACE score, and other questions about people's health to measure their own shameflammation, for them to kind of see, how's my gut feeling connection? How is it? So all that stuff's at drwillcole.com.
That's fantastic. That's really a great place to start. People can start there and get people love quizzes. So it's a great place to start the process. So thank you for that. Well, I'm really excited, and thank you so much for sharing your wisdom again. And I look forward to our next conversation.
Likewise, it has to be in person next time, my friend.
For sure. It's absolutely for sure. We've enough of this over the airwave stuff. Yeah, let's do the real thing. Not that it's bad, at least we can do it. At least we can converse, but in person's always the best.
Yeah.
Thanks, Will.